Hello, I want to welcome everyone to the 7th Annual TEWC Water College. Due to the lingering concerns over COVID-19, it was necessary to conduct this year's program in a virtual format. You will still be able to ask questions at the end of this presentation. However, Bob Glodt and I will jointly present this program today. The title of the presentation is Prescription, Irrigation, and Seeding Rates for Cotton in a Dry Year. The overall objective of this study was to evaluate the economic benefits of irrigating cotton under the same sprinkler irrigation system at two different PET irrigation levels. When we started this study, we didn't know it was going to be a dry year, but it was. And it was one of the driest years on record for our area, even worse than 2011. I also need to point out that the TEWC website used to collect PET data is currently being updated. Therefore, the PET numbers that were used were estimates. This study actually included two different fields. Each field had two water regimes, a high water regime and a low water regime. The low water portion of the field was planted at a lower seeding rate than the high water portion. One field had an irrigation capacity of 140 gallons per minute, and the other one was close to 350 gallons per minute. And as I stated previously, the irrigations were based on an estimated PET calculation. The Hunter farm has 140 gallons per minute capability. This farm was planted on May the 15th, and the variety was Delta Pine 1822. This cotton was irrigated at approximately 50% and 25% of potential evaporation transpiration in the high and the low water regimes. The total water that was applied was 10 inches for the high water side and 5 inches for the low water side. The acreage for both the low water and the high water regimes was 38 acres each.
In this slide, you will see drone footage on the Hunter farm, which is 140 gallon per minute pivot. It shows footage both pre-harvest, when the cotton still had leaves on it, as well as right before the harvesters came into the field. So this will kind of give you a perspective of what the cotton looked like.
The home pivot has a capacity of 350 gallons per minute. This field was planted on May the 16th, one day after the Hunter place. The variety was Delta Pine 1822. The high water side was irrigated at 60% of PET, and the low water side was irrigated at about 40% of PET. A total of 15.5 inches was applied on the high water side and 13 inches was applied on the low water side. A total of 54 acres was planted on the high water portion of the field. 36 acres was planted on the low water portion. There was also 48 acres of irrigated seed sorghum planted under this pivot.
This is the home pivot, and it will show you the same kind of perspective as we showed you on the Hunter. This is a 350 gallon per minute pivot, and there's footage of both pre-defoliation and post-defoliation that was taken just prior to harvest.
The seeding rates for the low water regime was lower than the high water regimes on both farms. For the low water side on both the Hunter and the home farms, 45,000 seed per acre were planted. The high water portion of the home place was planted at 65,000 seeds per acre, whereas 60,000 seeds were planted on the high water portion on the Hunter place. Adequate stands that were not skippy were achieved on both farms. The soil type on both farms is a Pullman clay loam, and achieving adequate stands can sometimes be a problem, especially when small seeded varieties or when adverse weather conditions are prevalent around the time of cotton is germinating and emerging. For us anyway, seeding rates are selected based on the number of seeds per acre needed to achieve uniform stands. We know full well that we could get by with less seed than what we used in this study, as long as we could get less up without having a skippy stands. There is no saying in this area. One seed helps push for the seeds next to it. The high water portion of the Hunter yielded 758 pounds of lint per acre, whereas the low water side only yielded 238 pounds of lint per acre. The home place yielded 1,145 pounds and 913 pounds of lint per acre on the high and the low water portions, respectively. The economics of these planting scenarios will be discussed later in the presentation. The lint percentages on the high and the low water on the Hunter were nearly identical. On the home farm, however, the lint percentages were higher on the low water side than on the high water portion of the field. There were no visual apparent differences that would explain the difference in turnout between the two irrigation systems. The high water side of the field had a little more immature bolls that contributed to the lower turnout. We did receive some rains in late September that would not have contributed to yields. However, these rains were enough to result in more immature bolls on the high water side at harvest. As I mentioned, this difference was not visually apparent from the seat of a cotton stripper. There were no major differences in seed weights between either the Hunter or the home place. This slide was included in the presentation because some growers may be concerned that lower seed weights per bale will result when irrigation levels are reduced. This was not the case in this variety this year. The loan prices presented in this graph shows that the lower water portion of the Hunter had a significant lower loan price than did the high water Hunter, or either the high water or the low water sides of the home place. This difference can be accounted for by lower staple length on the limited water portion of the Hunter field. I will show only the grade, staple, and micronear values for the 4 fields in this study. There were no differences in the other factors such as leaf trash, strength, or uniformity between the 4 irrigation regimes in question. There were no economic differences in grade or micronear between the 2 farms and the 2 irrigation regimes on each farm. All grades were 21 and all micronear fell between 3.5 and 4.9. This chart represents overall production cost for the Hunter and home place farms. Fertilizer needs were determined by soil sample results. Fertilizer amounts were the same for both the high water and the low water irrigation levels on the Hunter as well as on the home place. Since the home place was a higher irrigation potential, more fertilizer was applied on the home place. The objective of split pivot irrigation for the limited irrigation part of the field is to have rainfall make up the lack of irrigation capacity. In 2020, however, there was essentially little or no rainfall that fell from the time cotton reached bloom stage until the first open boll stage of development. So on the hunter, fertility levels on the low water side of the pivot were greater than the yields that were achieved, especially since there was no supplemental rainfall occurred after flower. Income and value per acre presented in this chart is based solely on the loan values of cotton and not market values. The gross income showed that in a dry year like 2020, gross income increases as water availability increases. This is nearly always the case in cotton in our area. But was there potential for profit when irrigating in a split pivot scenario? Bob will address this in the second half of this presentation. Expenses increased proportionally as irrigation increased. The high water and low water portions of the home place had the greatest cost per acre, followed by the hunter, high water, and the low water. Based on loan rates, all fields generated a small profit per acre except the limited irrigation on the hunter farm. The per acre loss on the low irrigated hunter place was approximately $154 per acre. I knew early on that this portion of the pivot should have been abandoned to cut losses, but it was clear that by the first week of blooming that this field would not recover from drought to produce a profit. I chose to continue irrigating the low water side because I wanted to have the data for this presentation. Bob has worked up data on yield responses to water from several years of conducting irrigation response trials for cotton. When irrigating at a percentage of PET, we know that early season watering prior to flower involves keeping moisture in the root zone, and additional water should be applied either through rainfall or irrigation to help buffer the shortfall of water you will be able to apply during the growing season. Everyone in this area irrigates at a deficit. No one has the irrigation capacity to irrigate at 100% of PET or crop demand. It is the post-bloom irrigations that for the most part determine yields. In this chart, I have shown the total amount of water applied and how much of the total was applied post-flower. So on the hunter, high water, a total of 10 inches was applied, and about 7.5 inches of that was applied after flower. The hunter low water had about 5 inches of total irrigation and rainfall, and 3.5 of that was applied after early flower. The home had high water, had a total of 15.5 inches of water and 13 applied after flower. The home low water received 13 inches of water and 10 inches of that was applied after early bloom. This data will allow us to determine how much lint was produced per inch of water. The amount of lint produced per inch of water is shown. Remember, this was calculated on the amount of water that was received after flower and not season-long irrigation. For all practical purposes, the amount of lint produced per inch of water was close for all fields except for the hunter low water. In the better irrigated fields, between 88 and 101 pounds of lint was produced per inch. The hunter low water, however, only produced 68 pounds of lint per inch. This field received only 3.5 inches of water post-flower and was visibly stressed all season long. Water efficiency in terms of pounds of lint produced per inch of water always decreases when cotton is significantly stressed for water post-bloom. I wanted to know how much rainfall, in addition to the 3.5 inches of irrigation I applied on the Hunter low water field, to have reached a break-even point, since pounds of lint would have increased as water was increased on the Hunter low water portion of the field. I averaged the pounds lint figures for the Hunter high water and the Hunter low water and divided by 2. This should be a reasonable figure for calculating how much rainfall would have been required to reach the break-even portion of this field. The pound of lint per inch was calculated to be 85. A break-even based on loan values would have required about 3.6 inches of rainfall after flower, when considering that 2020 was as bad or a worse drought year than 2011. That is less water than I would have expected. When using the data from the home farm, I had $105 less expenses and only $40 in less income. Those savings came mostly from irrigation and seed costs per acre. If we would have received a portion of our rainfall during our growing season, you can see the results would be greatly different based upon the amount of yield per acre inch of water received up to a point. My seeding rates are higher because of soil temperatures, or lower when I'm trying to plant, and with seed quality and low cool weather germination of seed, I am trying to achieve a uniform stand of 35 to 45,000 seed per acre on the high side of the planting rates. I believe this is a way to help manage risk and continue to still plant all of the pivot without idling any land under a pivot. A good rule of thumb that I have learned and experienced in trying to irrigate cotton at 60 to 65% of PET, or try to maintain about 4 gallons per acre per minute during post-flowering of cotton. Water management has become a part of my operation, just like all the other inputs that go into a crop production. It is also the most predictable of all. I would like to thank you for joining us this morning for our TWC Virtual Water College. If you have any questions, please feel free to give me a call. When using the data from the home farm, I had $105 less expenses and only $40 in less income. Those savings came mostly from irrigation and seed costs per acre. If we would have received a portion of our rainfall during our growing season, you can see the results would be greatly different based upon the amount of yield per acre inch of water received up to a point. My seeding rates are higher because of soil temperatures, or lower when I'm trying to plant, and with seed quality and low cool weather germ of seed, I'm trying to achieve a uniform stand of 35,000 to 45,000 seed per acre on the high side of the planting rates. I believe this is a way to help manage risk and continue to still plant all of the pivot without idling any land under a pivot. A good rule of thumb that I have learned and experienced is trying to irrigate cotton at 60 to 65% of PET, or trying to maintain about 4 gallons per minute per acre during post-flowering of cotton. Water management has become a part of my operation, just like all of the other inputs that go into crop production. It is also the most predictable of all. I would like to thank you for joining us this morning for our TWC Virtual Water College. If you have any questions, please feel free to give me a call.
For my part of the presentation, I will cover 3 major areas. I will discuss some of the logistics problems that growers faced in a dry year like 2020. Second, we'll go over some historical yield data as it relates to how much water is required to achieve a specific yield goal. And third, we will talk about criteria that should be considered when reallocating irrigation resources to a portion of a planted field. And last, I will discuss how hand probing the soil to determine moisture by feel can be used as a valuable tool in irrigation scheduling. In 2020, most growers had too much cotton and not enough water. In our area, we depend on post-bloom rainfall to provide a soil moisture reserve to contribute to yields. In 2020, little or no rainfall fell after the onset of blooming. Also, hotter than normal temperatures and windy conditions resulted in the potential evapotranspiration rates that were much higher in 2020 than in previous years. In other words, crop water demand was higher and supplemental rainfall was lower. I believe in the future, growers who overplant and hope for rain should be prepared from the start to abandon a portion of their acres if dry conditions prevail. The split pivot irrigation approach that Glenn talked about today is a good example of overplanting in hopes of achieving profitable yields as long as you get a little help from supplemental rainfall after the bloom stage. In most years, this is a sound strategy with the exception of this one. In many cases, irrigation levels or irrigation intervals were too long. I have often said more water less often is better than less water more often. Although I still abide by this irrigation concept, there is a limit in the length of time between irrigation cycles before yields are impacted. The only way to achieve a shorter irrigation interval is to plant less cotton acreage or to water less acreage than you plant. Inefficient irrigation systems rob growers of potential yield every year. Increasing irrigation efficiency is like increasing pumping capacity. Broadcast spray systems are terribly inefficient, and growers should consider seriously changing to LIPA technology. The redistribution of water, or making the decision to abandon acres under drought conditions, should be made prior to first flower. Water use rates go up dramatically when cotton reaches the first flower stage. At peak bloom, cotton water use rates can range from 0.28 to 0.31 inches per day at 100% of PET. Decisions to abandon acres prior to or just at the appearance of first flower increases the likelihood that soil moisture levels can be somewhat replenished with your current irrigation program on that portion of the crop that you intend to keep. And this would be done before water demand got too high. Soil moisture reserve is very critical in obtaining top yields. Before showing yield data versus PET, it is important to understand how this data was generated. The yield data I will present was generated using weekly irrigations at 30, 60, and 90% of potential evapotranspiration. The word weekly irrigations is very important. And being able to consistently deliver water to a crop at a percentage of PET is also very important in duplicating the yields that I'm about to present in the following charts. Second, if irrigation intervals are greater than 7 days, yields will be lower than what I present here today. And the last guideline for understanding the data is the irrigation delivery system used to generate this data was a LIPA system. A LIPA irrigation system delivers water to every other furrow in a bubble spray pattern rather than in a broadcast spray mode. Yield reduction should be expected when less efficient irrigation delivery systems are used. I will go into more detail for each of these main talking points in subsequent slides. Understanding the relationship between yield and water. How much yield can you make with the water you have? As an example, let's assume that a grower overplanted cotton this year, hoping to receive assistance from rainfall in order to make the crop. Then no rain came, and now the grower is faced with the option of underwatering what was originally planted or abandoning a portion of a field and redistributing water to what is left. Wouldn't it be beneficial if you could estimate yields when adapting to such scenarios? By knowing this, you would more be able to make a decision on how much to abandon and how much to keep. So if a grower planted 100 acres of cotton and could only apply about 67/100ths of an inch per week, this would be close to about 30% of PET. It would require an irrigation capacity of close to 2 gallons per minute per acre. If irrigated acres was reduced by half, or only 50 acres out of the original 100, this would equal 1.3 inches of water per week that could be applied at 60% of PET. By reducing acreage 50%, this represents a capacity of about 4 gallons per minute per acre. So now let's look at yield potential. Yield goals versus water. Between 2009 and 2018, I conducted water use efficiency research for major seed companies located in our area. I selected 2012, 2013, and 2014 for the yield performance data presented here today, because these 3 years represent a dry year, a wet year, and a year that was in between dry and wet. When I say dry, wet, or in between, I am referring to rainfall that fell after first flower rather than season-long rainfall averages. Post-flower rainfall is what contributes most to cotton yields when irrigating at a deficit, and we all irrigate at a deficit. The yields reported are averages for 7 to 12 cotton varieties that were tested each year. I have looked at more recent water use efficiency data, and the results have fallen comfortably within the ranges reported between 2012 and 2014. The soil type for the Olton and Edmondson locations was Olton clay loam and Pullman clay loam. These two soil types have a soil moisture holding capacity of between 1 and 1.25 inches of water per foot that is available when at field capacity. There were 4 irrigation regimes in each one of these studies. The first is a rain-fed, as represented by the letters RF in the table. The rain-fed regime in all 3 years was not dryland. The rain-fed cotton was actually irrigated up until first flower, and then the irrigations were terminated. There was a range of 327 pounds of lint per acre for a low, up to 786 pounds of lint per acre for a high in the rain-fed regime. It is important to remember that cotton that relies solely on post-flower rainfall will have considerable yield variability from one year to the next. This is always the case for dryland or similar scenarios where yield is dependent on the rain that falls after first flower. The second irrigation regime was irrigated at 30% of potential evaporation, or 0.67 inches per week at peak demand. Yields in 30% PET range from 801 pounds of lint per acre to 1,067 pounds of lint per acre. You should notice that the spread between the lowest and highest yields were lower than what we saw in the rain-fed regime. Or another way to look at this is the 30% PET would yield about 801 pounds of lint per acre in somewhat dry year and 1,067 pounds of lint per acre in a wetter year, and about 897 pounds of lint per acre on an average rainfall year. The third irrigation regime is 60% of PET, or 1.3 inches per week at peak demand. A low of 1,210 pounds of lint per acre and a high of 1,388 pounds of lint per acre was achieved. Please notice that once you consistently add water post-flowering, the variability between yields from one year to the next is less as compared to the rain-fed and the 30% regimes. Then the last regime is 90% of PET, or about 1.8 inches of water per week during peak demand. The average yield was 1,481 pounds of lint per acre for the 90% regime, and this was not much greater than the 60%. When irrigation exceeds 60 to 70% of PET, the pounds of lint per acre inch of water applied decreases. The data is telling us that the 90% regime represents too much water for the amount of growing season available in this region of Texas. Many growers like to think in terms of gallons per minute per acre rather than inches of water per week. The 30% PET is about 2 gallons per minute per acre, whereas 60% of PET is close to 4 gallons per minute per acre. I like to think in terms of irrigating at a percentage of PET. In this chart, I converted the amount of water available to irrigate a cotton crop on a weekly basis to a percentage of PET. The red cells in this chart represent irrigation levels below 30% and above 90% of PET. I do not have data on variety irrigation performance at levels below 30% of PET or at 90% or above. So if you have 200 gallon per acre irrigation capacity, you could irrigate 100 acres at 32% of PET. If you reduce the acreage by half, or 50 acres, you could irrigate at 66% of PET. Another example would be for pivots with a capacity of 300 gallons per minute. If you had 120 acres planted, you could be able to irrigate at around 39% of PET. If you reduce the amount of acreage planted from 120 to 80 acres, you would be able to irrigate at 66% of PET. So now let's look at what yields you could reasonably expect to achieve at these various PET levels. This chart represents general yields that could be achieved with different amounts of water. Much of this is extrapolated data. In other words, I use the 30, 60, and 90% PET yields to estimate the yield that could be achieved if cotton were irrigated, for example, at 46%. I will admit these numbers are probably only close and not based on irrigating specifically at each given percentage of PET represented in the chart. So if you were irrigating at 200 gallons per minute on 100 acres, this would be approximately 32% of PET, and the estimated yield would be approximately 924 pounds of lint per acre. If the acres irrigated were cut in half, you could now irrigate at 64% of PET and could expect yields of around 1,332 pounds of lint per acre. With 120 acres and 300 gallons per minute, you could be irrigating at 39% of PET and could expect yields of around 1,018 pounds of lint per acre. If acres were reduced from 120 to 80 acres, the PET irrigation levels would be 66%, and the crop could be expected to achieve around 1,332 pounds of lint per acre. One thing you need to remember is this: these yields were obtained with weekly irrigation intervals and were watered with a LIPA irrigation system. Changing the interval or watering with an inefficient irrigation system will reduce the yields I'm reporting here. So what are some criteria that you should consider when abandoning a portion of a field? First, let me start by saying that planting more than you can irrigate at 30, 60% of PET and counting on rainfall to make up irrigation shortfalls is a pretty good strategy in many years. But in a year like this, you have to be prepared to make adjustments. 3 criteria when considering abandonment of a portion of a field are as follows. Number 1, your inability to apply irrigations on a weekly irrigation cycle. Second, the inability to deliver adequate irrigation to achieve the desired yield goal based on the number of acres you have planted. Or last is the crop growth stage that the cotton is presently in when those decisions are being made. So we've talked a little bit about irrigation efficiency, and I want to review this a little bit more, comparing broadcast spray versus LIPA and why LIPA is more efficient. In broadcast spray systems, these are only about 50% efficient. And the reason is water is distributed across the entire profile, so there are higher evaporation rates. Also, there is less penetration of water into the soil profile when you spread that same inch across the entire soil profile. LIPA irrigation systems are about 80% efficient, and it's because water is concentrated in every other furrow rather than being spread over the whole soil profile. And because of this, there are lower evaporation rates. And also you can achieve deeper penetration of water into the soil profile with a LIPA system rather than a broadcast spray system. So what is the value of irrigation efficiency? We just discussed broadcast spray and LIPA. So on a broadcast spray system, we said it's about 50% efficient. A LIPA system is about 80% efficient. So that means in a broadcast spray, for every inch you apply, the crop benefits from only 1/2 inch. For every inch applied in a LIPA system, the crop benefits from about 8/10 of an inch. So if you say you irrigated a field 6 times after bloom, only 3 inches would be available to the crop in a broadcast spray system. The same 6 inches, if were applied post-bloom in the LIPA system, you would have 4.8 inches that would benefit the crop. There's a net gain of 1.8 inches per acre. At 80 to 90 pounds of lint per inch yield per inch of water, that represents about 144 to 162 pounds of lint per acre gain just on efficiency alone. Considering reduced tillage systems. Reduced tillage systems takes advantage of rainfall and usually reduces the amount of pre-plant irrigation that is needed. Second, there is less evaporative loss when post-emergence irrigations are applied under reduced tillage systems. And last, there is a net positive gain in moisture available to the plants all season long when you have some type of cover over the rows that are being irrigated. Reduced tillage systems is an issue that many people are going to have to consider for the future. What hand probing the soil could have told you in 2020. Hand probing and determining moisture by feel is old technology, but it's still very, very useful today. By hand probing, you could determine the amount of water available to plants ahead of or behind the pivot. You could have also determined the depth to which water was penetrating into the soil profile. Hand probing can be used to calculate the number of days a given amount of soil moisture will last based on the water use of a crop at a specific time. Thank you for your attention, and if you have any questions from either Glenn or myself, feel free to ask them at this time.